for yourself, you have a lot of personal challenges to meet clients, to make clients, that sort of thing. But it's not the same as going outdoors and really pressing yourself in real ways that you can see a ladder or a rope or something that you can actually physically get a hold of. And you translate those experiences and your success with them then back into those parts of your private and professional life that may be a little less concrete.
I was afraid to come because I'd heard that we would have to do things in high places, and I'm afraid of heights. But I thought it would be a growth experience, and so I forced myself to come. The hardest part was letting myself trust the other women, I think. Initially, I didn't want to feel vulnerable. I didn't know what they would think of me. I was afraid of what they would think once they knew my weaknesses, once they knew that I wasn't as strong as I might appear to be or whatever. And then my greatest fear later was just some of the physical feats of trying to get those done.
In an event like the Giant's Ladder, here we have women climbing what looks to be an almost insurmountable, to an insurmountable height. And what they're learning in this event is they're overcoming fear, they're rising to a challenge, they're having to make decisions about how they're going to get up the ladder. They're having to problem solve if they get stuck midway. How am I going to get out of this? Am I going to be able to be let down? Who's going to come up and save me? Can I be saved at all? One of the things I try to transmit in my training is that quitting is an easy habit to get into. And we're trying to encourage women to set goals that are achievable and to finish them.
Isn't that neat? Isn't that neat? Yeah, it's kind of neat.
I'm glad I didn't quit. I know that I'm not a quitter. And I suspected it before I came here, but it's important to try it again.
I learned that I could do it, and I learned how I react when I'm put under pressure, and I learned that it's not so bad to try and put myself through some kind of challenge, some kind of feat.
But Great Encounters is not just games in the woods. The two-day workshop includes debriefing sessions for the women to articulate the career problems they are trying to solve by tackling these physical ones.
I know that this training really works because I have people set goals at the end of every session, and then I check back with them. And for instance, I had a woman in the Justice Department who was in a research division, and she wanted to go into litigation. And 3 months after she took this course, she was in a litigating position. That's what she wanted. I've had other women say, I want to change my job and do it. Some women come with a specific problem, having difficulty in their work situation. And I did have one woman who was in an all-male office and was really having difficulty dealing with her male peers. Every time she came up with a suggestion, her male supervisor would pass it off as his solution. And the group suggestion was that she look for another job. And sure enough, in 30 days, she had another job.
There you go. There you go. All right. All right. Oh, it's all right. It's all right.
It was really difficult, but I can't believe I really made it. I really did. It was great. Really tremendous. Really feel good about myself for doing it.
It's interesting that in order to feel confident about yourself, you have to scare yourself to death. But it's not such a half-baked idea. The Army has used this concept for years to build a few good men. They also use it to create camaraderie, bonding the men together in a mutual experience. That's another thing women who climb the corporate ladder have been accused of lacking: team spirit. Well, maybe a weekend in the woods can't replace 4 years on the football team or going on survival hikes with the Scouts, but it can give a woman an intuition of the meaning behind that word macho, and a sure knowledge that she can indeed do it. Well, one of the things most people think they cannot do is handle money. And women are notoriously conservative when it comes to getting or investing it. Here to tell us about the 5 most common mistakes women make with their money is our financial expert, Susan Breakefield Fulton. Thank you for joining us, Susan.
Thank you, Fran.
Now, first of all, tell me, what are these 5 most common mistakes that women make?
Well, the most common one is procrastination. That's thinking if you don't do something today, maybe the need for it will go away tomorrow. And ignorance of money, not understanding how it works and how to use it. Failure to understand tax laws, not taking full advantage of the opportunities there. Failure to establish a definite goal, not deciding where you want to get to. And if you don't, it's awfully hard to get there. And finally, failure to establish a winning attitude. Failure to be willing to win.
Procrastination is such a difficult one to overcome. I was listening to the radio the other day and someone said, well, you don't get up in the morning and decide you're going to procrastinate your day away. What are some of the things we put off too long?
Oh, I guess the one that comes to mind most often for me is wills. A full 70% of the people who come into me don't have wills, and probably 50% of them have minor children, and particularly in that situation, not having a will is a real grievous procrastination.
And how about ignorance of money?
Oh, my favorite story, and I tell it to people all the time, is my best friend Betsy, who graduated from college a year after I and came to Washington a couple of years sooner than I did. And when I arrived, Betsy had a Triumph, which was what she had wanted more than anything in her whole life.
Good for her.
Yes, and it was a day when mortgage rates were like 4%, and Betsy was paying 18% for this Triumph. Because what she had done is scurry down to her local Triumph dealer and see if she could afford the payments.
So you really have to learn to shop around.
Sure, what you're doing when you borrow money is renting it, and there's no need to pay more rent than you have to.
I know every year about April, sometimes in January if I'm really on top of things, I get very nervous about tax laws and the IRS and all those things. What are some things we should know about
Well,
that?
one of the important things I think about taxes is that there's no need to pay more than you have to. And people who say to me, oh boy, I got a big refund, have in reality let the government use that extra money for the year instead of putting it in the bank or in a money market fund and letting themselves use that extra money for the year.
How do we determine how many deductions we should take?
There's a pretty general rule of thumb is that one deduction is worth $1,000. So that you can pretty well figure it out that way.
Well, that sounds good. And how about failure to establish a definite goal?
Sure. How are you going to get where you want to go if you don't know where it is? How many people don't even take the time to explore with their employer what kind of pension benefits they're getting, how they work, and whether they can contribute to them, whether there's a way they can add on money that will even gain them more dollars.
Do these definite goals have to do with things we want to buy, possess, aside from savings?
Usually they have to do with things we want, and usually those things are more psychological than physical. A college education for our kids, a secure retirement for ourselves, the ability to go back to school after the kids get off to school, all kinds of things like that that in a way we usually find ways to buy the things. We very often procrastinate on getting the goals.
And last but not least, failure to establish a winning attitude about money.
Yeah, if you don't have a winning attitude, none of it will work. If you believe it isn't going to work, it won't work. And one of the things that really bothers me is how few people honestly pay themselves when they pay everyone else. Say to themselves, I earn all this money and I'm going to pay the rent and I'm going to pay for the car and I'm going to pay for the clothes, but I'm also going to pay for myself to ensure that I can go back to school when I want to, or that I do have a secure retirement, or that I can have the home I think I dream about.
That's always such a difficult concept to come up with because we tend to think that everything we earn does in fact belong to us, but you're saying it belongs to those other people we paid the bills
Sure.
to.
And there's certain things you want that aren't part of bills, but are part of dreams, and that's paying yourself to get those dreams.
Thank you very much, Susan. Julia Walsh would agree. She thinks if you don't take risks, nothing big is going to happen. The first woman ever to sit on the American Stock Exchange and now chairman of her own investment firm, Walsh has taken many risks. The first big one was in 1958, shortly after her first husband died in a freak military accident. Julia was left at age 33 with 4 sons, ages 8 years down to 11 months. Her net worth was $40,000, so she decided to play $30,000 of it on the stock market. What happened then, Julia?
Well, first, Fran, let me change a word you use. You use the word play.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I don't think one should play in the stock market. I decided to invest at a high-risk level, but with very careful study of the risk and reward ratio in that environment. And that was what caused it to come out as well as it did.
Yes, because you already knew what the answer should be.
Should be. And
yes.
if things went well and I did my homework properly and I had properly evaluated the environment, that it should be a successful endeavor. Turned out to be more successful than I anticipated, but that's always good too.
That is very good. Julia, what went through your mind when you realized you were going to be the sole breadwinner of this family of 4 young sons?
Well, having lived through that, I think you're in a state of such shock that it's very hard to think of anything except sort of surviving till you get your act back together. And it took me several months. I think people are very hard on themselves when things like this happen to them. And I was in a sort of period in my life in which I could take a little time to get back into the proper pace. So I took about 3 months and finally was forced by a circumstance in my industry. You know, I already had been in the investment industry for a year or two, actually 2.5. And finally had an opportunity to go to a special school, and that got me back on track.
So you were fine at that point? I mean,
Well, not
you'd
fine.
made this,
It takes a couple of years.
Yes. But financially, I mean, you were beginning to get back.
Yes, I was getting back my feet, and I was, you know, making reasonably good money, and I had this little pot of money, the $40,000 you referred to, which was our insurance money. And so I felt not flushed in any way, but secure.
That must have still been very difficult. I mean, even though you'd done your homework and you had a pretty good idea of what was going to happen, there was still the risk that it could be lost. Did that thought ever occur to you?
Absolutely. Maybe not all lost. I diversified it well. I looked at the areas that I thought were the areas of the future, and probably if one looks back on it, knowing what I know today, the biggest risk was that my timing might have been quite off, because in the market, it's a very volatile situation. And sometimes when you do something right, it takes longer to work out than at other times. What probably was the biggest surprise was the time frame was about a year, where I really anticipated a 4 or 5 year time frame for what I was trying to do. But because of the change in market conditions going into 59, it happened much quicker than I anticipated.
Is that something you would advise your clients to do, given those circumstances now?
Probably not. I may help them decide to do it, but it would have to be a decision you made yourself. Because I think it's very important that you understand the risk and reward. That if you're right, this is what will happen in this time frame at the best scenario, that time frame at the worst scenario. And if you're wrong, this is the worst scenario.
You said before that you had already been working in the business for a couple of
Yes, I
years,
had.
and you'd gotten a master's degree, and you were working in a brokerage firm. You were a little bit ahead of your time at that point. How did you decide to get into it in the first place?
Well, I was, only because I was ahead of my time in several areas. I'd been a Foreign Service officer, and when I married my Army husband, we automatically were not permitted to stay in the Foreign Service.
Automatically?
We automatically drummed out of the Corps, as the saying goes. So then we came back.
Because you were married? That was
just because you're
specifically?
married, only reason. Might be in the same physical location, the same required, talents, whatever. So when I got back to Washington, I thrashed around saying, oh, I just got to do something. I can't sit around forever, because I was used to being very active. So I started to take a master's degree at GW, and there I met the president of Ferris & Company, George Ferris Jr., who was teaching the course, and got so very interested, and as he saw my interest, and I, always been in the market with a little bit of money I had, which wasn't much, believe me, and he saw that interest and offered me an opportunity to take the psychological test for adaptation to the industry, and I took them and did very well, and so he offered me an opportunity to see what I could do. In those days, there wasn't any formalized training program or any, training salary or anything. Just an opportunity to go in, learn the business, take
Sort of
the
like an
test.
apprentice.
Exactly. And I did that, and I had been in place about a year when my husband was killed.
What was it about your upbringing that caused you to go in this direction in the first place? I mean, that wasn't sort of playing with dolls and growing up to be a nurse. I mean, that was the world of finances, something completely different.
Yes, my mother and father came from Akron, Ohio, where I was born and raised, And my mother had had a little bit of stock all her life that had been paid to her in the Depression in lieu of salary of Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company.
Oh, how nice.
And she discussed that with me on numerous occasions, and I got interested in this. So I'm a product of the Second World War. I graduated from college just as the war ended, went off to the Foreign Service, and decided, based on really the biggest factor in my becoming an investor, was one of the several occasions I went behind the Iron Curtain and really saw how the other system worked, and really wanted to be a capitalist, a free enterpriser, part of a democratic society, and I figured owning stocks was the best way to do that. So I started investing my $25 a month, and that's how I got started.
I know you were at Harvard for a year or two, and you said to Gail Sheehy that that was really sort of a turning point in your life. How
That
did
was much later in my life,
Yeah.
after I bought my house and gotten settled and become a partner of Ferris and Company. They saw that I had sort of plateaued, and they very kindly offered me an opportunity to take this short, what's called advanced management program at Harvard. Harvard Business School never had a woman in that course, and the Ferrises were kind enough to carry the ball and get me in. And so I went to Harvard the spring of '62 for a 13-week course, 139 men and myself, and it was a hair-raising experience that I would not want to ever duplicate again.
I don't blame you. Exactly. What are some of the anecdotes you have from that period?
Take all day, but I want to tell you, I was so outside of the system in that school until about the 7th or 8th week that I really didn't even know what the system was. And that was really the problem in those days. There were so few of us that we were just outside the system. We didn't know we were outside the system. The men didn't know that we didn't know we were outside the system. So it was just a complete impasse. Exactly.
Were you doing all your studying on your own?
Completely on my own, not
together?
exactly. Not using the study groups, not doing any exchange of information, not tapping the talents of the other people. I was, you know, the stalwart, going alone type, and all that teamwork you hear about and all that cooperation. I didn't know was out there.
You were too smart. You did.
Right, I didn't need it.
At some point, of course, I suppose you did understand that there was some teamwork going on. At what
Well,
point
I was
in
about
the
ready to give up on the course when we had a case problem involving a woman. And a group of the men who met every morning to discuss the cases said to me, "Hey, Julia, we don't know how to deal with this case because there's this troublesome woman in it. Why don't you come to breakfast and talk, you know, give us your point of view on it." This was into the 8th week of a 13-week course. And I went to breakfast and found out by accident how the game was played. And then I got on that bandwagon and had a wonderful time the rest of the time and did my part of the homework and shared with them whatever. It was wonderful. But that was the hardest lesson I learned, is that I wasn't in the system and had to get there.
I've noticed that you have one of your sons and one of your stepsons, I believe, are vice presidents of the firm. You also have stepdaughters, none of whom are vice presidents, as I know of, and I'm just curious to know why.
Not yet, because most of my daughters were acquired when I remarried in 1963. And they had not been conditioned to think business, to think money, to think finance. They've taken a lot of turns since then because two of them are very active in business. One of them has a master's degree in business. But they weren't conditioned, so they came around much later in life to looking at business and were already in different areas. Our own daughter, the product of my second marriage, who's a sophomore now at Georgetown, probably will be part of our business organization when the time comes.
Do you think that's simply a product of the environment, that women haven't gone into business, specifically with your family and with other young women you've met?
Absolutely. I think it was very much conditioning. Remember, my daughter, that's a banker now, is 40. Actually, 37. Excuse me, my daughter, who has the master's degree from Wharton, she went to that weekend program, is 34. And they really only began to feel and look at business when they arrived at about 20 to 25. So they weren't prepared coming along. They weren't ready to look at it. They came around to it later. And I think a lot's happened in the last 10 years in that arena.
In other words, do you think that women are taking more risks now?
Not necessarily more risk, but I think they're much more realistic. And they're looking at where they want to be, and they're trying to decide how to get there. That may involve some risks in just inherently in making those kinds of decisions. As to money risk, I don't think so yet. But that's a matter also of experience. And a woman's got to get far enough along to be able to intelligently evaluate the risks she's taking.
Are you still taking the kinds of risks you were taking?
Well, probably not quite as much as I did in the beginning, because at the beginning I didn't have much to lose. And as life gets better, you have more at stake. But I always have a portion of whatever I'm investing in fairly high-risk investments.
What's the ratio of
Probably
risk?
80-20.
Were there ever months in your life or time in your life, and we have to be brief, I'm afraid, when you thought, I can't meet the goals I'm expecting of myself, I can't do it, and who did you rely on, and what did you do at that point?
Yes, there are oftentimes you challenge your own goals and think, well, one, can I do it, and two, is it worth it if I can? And I've had to reevaluate goals from time to time because when I remarried, there were 7 other children and my 4 boys and a little girl, and so I had to develop that along the way and adjust to whatever reality was so that I could deal with the world I was in.
Thank you very much. I hope we'll get to have you back so we can talk more about your wonderful life. Taking risks. It's not that we're strangers to them. 100 years ago, we faced death every time we took to bed in childbirth. But taking that risk taught us endurance, courage, and patience. What we need for today is a little recklessness, a willingness to put ourselves on the line. No apologies. Something women like Susan Anthony, Amelia Earhart, and Julia Walsh seem to come by naturally. The rest of us have to learn and relearn. If you have any thoughts about risks or reactions to our show, please share them with us. Write to Working Women, Owings Mills, Maryland, 21117. That's Working Women, Owings Mills, Maryland, 21117. See you next week. We'll be here. So should you.
Working Women has been brought to you by a general support grant from J.C. Penney, serving America's working women from coast to coast.
Presentation of Working Women is made possible by Noxema and CoverGirl divisions of Noxell Corporation. By Union Trust Bank. Union Trust Bank makes money matters simple. And by the members of Maryland Public Television.
Next on WonderWorks, who has seen the wind?
That not even the most profligate among us is beyond recall.
How's your dad? I don't know. Is it true that he turned all yellow?
Don't miss this touching 2-part story. Tomorrow night at 8.
The story of Jewish life in the Middle Ages is a story of prosperity and persecution. It begins in Arab-ruled Spain with a golden age of enlightenment shared by Muslims and Jews. But then the Christians take over and launch the First Crusade. And finally, the Spanish Inquisition drives the Jews out of Western Europe. Join Abba Eban for Heritage, Civilization and the Jews, the Crucible of Europe.
The story continues tomorrow night at 9, following WonderWorks.
Color Sounds rocks you. Color Sounds goes country. Color Sounds touches your soul. See the videos, hear the music, and learn the words on Color Sounds.
Every weeknight at 11. Sexual encounters of the floral kind. Tonight at 8 on Nature.
You're watching Maryland Public Television, Channel 67 in Baltimore, and in Frederick, Channel 62.